It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content.
I never thought my life would become what it is now. Sometimes when I look at the snowy streets of our small town in Canada, I think it's all a dream, but it's not a dream. This is my reality, filled with love, worries, hopes and people who have become part of my story. My name is Anna. I am 32 years old and I have a son, little Igor. He is 5 years old. He is my sunshine, my meaning and my main source of joy. We live in a quiet suburb of Toronto, in a cozy house that my husband and I bought 3 years ago. My husband's name is Alex, and he is the man I connected with 6 years ago. We met here in Canada, where I moved from Russia in search of a new life. Alex is Canadian, but his mom, Margaret, is originally from England. She is a person who has played a huge role in our story, though not always a positive one. But I'll start at the beginning. That day when everything changed started out as an ordinary morning. It was winter. There was a thick layer of snow outside the window, and Igor, as always, woke up before me. I heard him running down the hallway, humming something to himself. When I opened my eyes, he was already standing in the doorway of my bedroom with his favorite teddy bear in his hands. "Mom, look, the teddy bear wants breakfast," he said, smiling his mischievous smile. I laughed and reached out to hug him. Igor always knew how to cheer me up from the very morning. We went to the kitchen, where I started making breakfast. Alex had already left for work, so Igor and I had some time to ourselves. We ate pancakes with maple syrup, and Igor told me about his plans for the day. He wanted to build a snow fort in the yard and invite his best friend, Jake, to build it. But our plans were interrupted by the doorbell. I wasn't expecting guests, so I was a little surprised. When I opened the door, Margaret was standing on the doorstep. She was wearing a long cashmere coat and holding a large bag. Her face was flawless as always, perfect makeup, her hair styled, the scent of expensive perfume. She smiled, but I saw something intense in her eyes. "Anna, dear," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, of course not," I answered, letting her inside. "We were just having breakfast. Igor, look who's here." Jaeger looked out from behind me and said a shy hello. He had always been a little shy of Margaret. She was a mysterious figure to him, a grandmother who appeared rarely and always seemed a little cold. "Hello, Igor," she said, smiling at him. "You've gotten so big." He smiled back, but immediately hid behind my back. Margaret sighed and walked into the kitchen, where she sat down at the table. I offered her tea, but she declined. "Anna, I need to talk to you," she said, looking at me with a serious look. "It's important." I felt something inside me clench. Margaret never came unannounced, and her tone was alarming. I nodded and asked Igor to go play in his room. He obediently left, but I knew he would be listening to our conversation. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting down across from her. "It's about Alex," she began, folding her hands on the table. "And you, I think you're making a mistake." I frowned, not sure what she was talking about. Margaret had always been a little aloof, but now she seemed especially tense. "What mistake are you talking about?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "Your marriage," she answered bluntly. "Anna, you're a beautiful girl, but you're not right for my son. You're from different worlds. You don't understand his needs, his ambitions. He deserves more than that." Her words stabbed me in the heart. I knew Margaret had never been thrilled with our marriage, but to hear it right to my face was another matter. I felt anger start to rise up inside of me, but I held back. "Margaret, Alex and I love each other," I said, trying to speak firmly. "We have a son. We're happy together." "Happiness is an illusion," she said coldly. "You can't give him what he deserves, and I don't want my grandson to grow up in such an environment." I clenched my fists under the table, feeling the tears come to my eyes, but before I could answer, the doorbell rang. It was my friend, Lisa. She always showed up at just the right moment. Lisa is my best friend, whom we met in language school when I first came to Canada. She is from Ukraine, and we immediately found a common language. Lisa has always supported me, and now she was more helpful than ever. "Hi," she said, coming into the house and immediately sensing the tense atmosphere. "Oh, am I on time for something?" I nodded, feeling the tension subside a little. Lisa always knew how to lighten the mood. She looked at Margaret and smiled. "Hello, Margaret," she said, sitting down next to me. "How are you?" Margaret nodded coldly but said nothing. Lisa, as always, was not confused. "Anna, you look a little upset," she said, putting her hand on mine. "What's wrong?" I wanted to answer, but Margaret beat me to it. "We were discussing family matters," she said, standing up, "but I don't think this is the place or the time. Anna, think about what I said, for Jaeger's sake." With these words, she left the kitchen and headed for the door. I sat there, unable to move, until Lisa put her arms around me. "What was that?" she asked, looking at me with concern. "It was Margaret," I answered, feeling the tears finally bursting out. "She said that I wasn't right for Alex, that I was ruining his life." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Margaret," she said, shaking her head, "don't mind her. She just can't stand the fact that Alex chose you over some eligible bride of his." I knew Lisa was right, but Margaret's words still hurt me. I looked at the door behind which my mother-in-law had disappeared and felt something change inside me. This was only the first act of our story, and I knew there were many more trials ahead of us. But I also knew that I had Lisa, my son Igor and, of course, Alex, and for their sake I was ready to fight for our family. After Margaret left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, trying to get my thoughts in order. Lisa was there, as always. She poured me tea and sat across from me, looking at me understandingly. Jaeger, hearing that Grandma had left, cautiously peeked out of his room. His big eyes expressed concern. "Mom, are you crying?" he asked, coming up to me and placing his small hand on mine. I smiled despite the tears and hugged him. Igor always sensed when I was having a hard time. He was so sensitive, so kind. I kissed him on the top of his head and told him that everything was fine, that Mom was just a little tired. "Come on, I'll show you the new drawing," he offered, trying to distract me. I nodded and followed him into the room. Igor showed me a drawing of our family, him, me, Alex, and even our dog Barney. The drawing was bright, full of joy and warmth. It made me feel so much better. "It's beautiful," I said, hugging him. "You're a real artist." He laughed and ran back to his toys. I went back to the kitchen where Lisa was still sitting at the table. "So, how are you doing?" she asked, looking at me with concern. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Margaret has always been cold, but today she went over the top. I don't know how to react to this." "You don't have to react," Lisa said, shrugging her shoulders. "It's her problem, not yours. You and Alex are adults, and only you decide how you want to live your lives, and Margaret just can't accept that she's no longer in charge of her son's life." I knew Lisa was right, but I still felt insecure. Margaret was a strong woman, and her words always carried weight. I was afraid that her opinion might sway Alex, even though he had never shown that he doubted our marriage. In the evening, when Alex got home from work, I decided to talk to him. He immediately noticed that something was wrong and asked what was wrong. I told him about his mother's visit and what she had said. Alex listened to me in silence, his face growing more and more serious. "She has no right to talk to you like that," he finally said, putting his arms around me. "You're my wife, and I love you. No one can destroy what we have." His words reassured me, but I still felt anxious. Margaret was not a person who would just back down like that. I knew this was just the beginning. The next day, I decided to distract myself and spend time with Igor. We went to the park where he was playing with other kids and I sat on a bench watching him. At some point Lisa came up to me. She brought 2 coffees and sat next to me. "So, how are you?" she asked, handing me a cup. "Better," I answered. Alex supported me, but I still feel like Margaret won't stop. "She's just trying to control the situation," Lisa said, "but you're stronger than you think. You'll get through this." I wanted to believe her, But deep down I still doubted her. Margaret was like a hurricane that could destroy everything in its path, and I was afraid that the next time I saw her would be even more difficult. A few days later, Margaret reappeared in our lives. This time she didn't come alone, but with some woman. It was her friend, whom she introduced as a very successful and influential person. I immediately realized that this was not just a courtesy visit. "Anna, this is Sarah," Margaret said, smiling, but there was something cold in her eyes. "She wanted to meet you." I said hello, feeling the tension building. Sarah was a tall, elegant woman with impeccable manners. She smiled, but her smile seemed fake. "Margaret has told me a lot about you," Sarah said, looking at me curiously. "You must be a very strong woman to have dealt with such a difficult situation." I felt something inside me clench. Her words were full of hidden meaning, and I realized that Margaret had brought her here for a reason. It was another attempt to prove to me that I didn't fit into their world. "Thank you," I replied dryly, trying to stay calm, "but I don't think our situation is that complicated." Sarah smiled, but didn't say anything. Margaret continued to talk about the importance of meeting expectations and being on top of things. I could feel the anger starting to rise in me, but I held back for the sake of Igor, who was playing in the next room. When they finally left, I felt relieved but also devastated. I realized that Margaret wasn't going to stop, and that I needed to be ready for a new challenge. In the evening, I told Alex about his mother and Sarah's visit. He seemed annoyed, but not surprised. "She always does that," he said, sighing. "She tries to control everything and everyone, but I won't let her interfere in our lives." I wanted to believe him, but in the back of my mind I still doubted him. Margaret was like a shadow that was always around, and I knew she would reappear sooner or later. But I also knew that I had Alex, Igor and Lisa, and for their sake, I was willing to fight for our family no matter what. After that visit from Margaret and Sarah, I felt something inside me change. I could no longer just ignore her words as I had before. They were like fine needles digging into my mind, leaving behind anxiety and doubt. I tried not to show it to Alex, but he sensed my condition. As always, he became more attentive, hugging me more often, trying to spend more time with Igor, as if he wanted to prove that our family was the most important thing to him. But Margaret wasn't going to stop. A week later, I received a letter from her. It was written on heavy paper, with her name engraved in the top corner. In the letter she expressed her concern about Igor's future and suggested that we discuss possible options for his upbringing. She wrote that she had connections in the best schools in Toronto and that she would be willing to pay for his education if I agreed to her terms. These conditions were not explicitly stated, of course, but I sensed that there was more behind them than just concern for my grandson. I didn't show the letter to Alex. Instead, I hid it in my desk drawer, hoping I could forget about it, but I couldn't. It hung like a dark cloud over my thoughts, reminding me every time I looked at Igor. He was so carefree, so happy. I didn't want his childhood to be overshadowed by the struggles I was having. Lisa, as always, sensed my condition. She came to me almost every day, brought me coffee and just sat next to me without asking too many questions. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in this stuffy atmosphere that Margaret created. One day, when we were sitting in the kitchen and Igor was playing in the living room, Lisa put her hand on mine and looked into my eyes. Her gaze was supportive, and I realized that she knew more than she was saying. "You're not alone," she said quietly, and the words were enough to make me feel like I could handle it. But Margaret only seemed to be gaining momentum. A few days later I received another letter. This time it was addressed not only to me, but also to Alex. In it, she insisted on a meeting to discuss the future of the family. I realized I couldn't keep it from my husband any longer. When I showed him the letter, his face turned stony. He read it silently and then folded it and put it on the table. "We will go to this meeting," he said, looking at me, but only to put an end to her games. I nodded, feeling anxiety clench my heart. I didn't know what to expect from this meeting, but I realized that it would be a turning point in our history. The meeting was scheduled at a restaurant in downtown Toronto. Margaret chose a place that I knew would emphasize her status. When we walked in, she was already seated at a table by the window, dressed in an elegant dress and with impeccable makeup. Next to her sat Sarah, the same woman who had been at our house. They were both smiling, but there was no warmth in their smiles. We sat down at the table, and Margaret started talking at once. She talked about Igor's future, about how important it was to give him a proper upbringing and a decent education. She mentioned her connections, her opportunities, her resources. Her words were like thin blades that she thrust into our lives, trying to tear us apart. Alex listened to her silently, but I could see his hands clenching into fists under the table. When she was done, he looked at her and said something I'll never forget. He said that our family was his choice and that no one, not even her, had the right to interfere in our lives. His voice was firm, and there was determination in his eyes. Margaret was silent for a moment, but then she smiled. Her smile was as cold as ice. "You'll be sorry," she said, rising from the table, "but by then it will be too late." With those words, she walked away, leaving us in silence. I felt something inside me break, but at the same time I realized that this was only the first step in our struggle. Margaret would not give up so easily, and I knew that there were more challenges ahead of us. But I also knew that I had Alex, Igor and Lisa, and for their sake, I was ready to fight to the end. After that meeting at the restaurant, I thought Margaret would back off, but I underestimated her. She wasn't used to losing, and her next move came as a complete surprise. A few days later, I received a letter from my lawyer. It was official, stamped and signed. It said that Margaret was suing for custody of Jaeger. The grounds for this she called the parents' inability to provide decent conditions for the child's upbringing. I couldn't believe my eyes. My hands were shaking as I read these lines. How could she have gotten to this point? I called Alex right away. He was at work, but when he heard what I said, he said he'd be home as soon as possible. When he arrived, his face was pale and his eyes were burning with anger. He took the letter, read it, and threw it on the table. "It's a war," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice, "and we're going to win it." We hired a lawyer who specialized in family law. His name was Michael, and he told us right away that the case would be complicated. Margaret was a powerful woman with a lot of connections, and she wasn't going down without a fight. But Michael was confident that we had a good chance if we could prove that Igor was happy and healthy in our family. Weeks of intense preparation began. We collected documents, certificates, testimonies from Igor's teachers, doctors, neighbors. Every day I could feel the tension building up. Igor, of course, did not understand what was happening, but he could sense that something was wrong. He became more quiet, more withdrawn. It tore at my heart. Lisa was our rock during those days. She came every day, helped with Igor, cooked meals, just sat by my side when I needed to talk. Her support was invaluable. The trial was scheduled in a month. It was the longest month of my life. Every day I woke up thinking that I could lose my son. Every day I fought with myself not to break down. And then the day of the trial came. We went there as a family. Alex held my hand and Igor sat between us, holding his teddy bear. Margaret was there, in her immaculate suit, with a cold and confident expression on her face. She didn't even look in our direction. The trial lasted several hours. Margaret's lawyer argued that we were incapable of providing Igor with a decent future. Our lawyer, in turn, presented evidence that Igor was happy, healthy and surrounded by love. I sat clutching Alex's hand and prayed that the judge would see the truth. When the judge began to announce the decision, I felt my heart ready to burst out of my chest. He spoke for a long time, analyzing all the evidence, all the arguments, and finally, he said the words I'll never forget. "The suit is dismissed. Custody is awarded to the parents." I couldn't hold back my tears. Alex hugged me, and Igor, not fully understanding what was happening, smiled and said he wanted ice cream. We all laughed, and at that moment I felt that the worst was over. But Margaret didn't give up. As we were leaving the courtroom, she came up to us. Her face was stony, But I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Pain. She looked at Alex, then at me, and said, "Do you think you've won? You don't understand anything. You're ruining his future." Alex looked at her and said, "Mom, that's enough. You've lost. Go home." She froze for a moment and then turned and walked away. We never saw her again. A few months passed. Life gradually returned to normal. Igor became cheerful and carefree again. Alex and I became even closer to each other. We thought it was over, but one morning I got a letter. It was from Margaret. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was just one piece of paper that said, "You think you know everything, but you are mistaken. The truth you are so afraid to know lies in the past, and when you do, your life will change forever." I reread those lines several times, feeling a chill run down my spine. What did she mean by that? What was the truth? I looked over at Alex, who was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. He was smiling, unaware of what I was holding in my hands. And in that moment, I realized that this was just the beginning, that somewhere out there, in the past, lurked a secret that could destroy everything we had. But I also realized that I was ready for it, because I have Alex, Igor and Lisa, and for their sake, I'm ready to fight to the end.